My name is Julian Hayes. I am 32 years old, and the evening my father chose to belittle me at our autumn feast, he managed it with a grin so refined it almost resembled affection. He raised his crystal goblet, stared directly at me, and announced that my brother had just acquired a stunning estate, a proper residence. Is that not magnificent? Perhaps by next autumn, you will eventually be prepared to establish roots as well. The entire dining room chuckled in the manner guests do when they believe they are witnessing an innocent domestic jest, and opposite me, my brother reclined against his seat, displaying that slight, contented grin I had recognized since our youth. Yes, he agreed, prolonging the syllable as though he were addressing an adolescent rather than a mature man, asking when I would cease wandering and begin constructing a genuine existence. I recall placing my silverware on the table with extreme caution, since after dedicating decades to mastering how to avoid erupting before individuals who relish challenging your pride, you become skilled at tiny, exact gestures. Subsequently, I grinned. Not the hurt expression they anticipated, not the ashamed look they had, conditioned me to display a tranquil one. I have already done so, I replied. I merely withheld invitations from anyone who questions my potential. My brother's face became motionless. My father blinked. And during the quietness that ensued, I discovered something magnificent. For the initial moment in my existence, I was not the individual being evaluated at that gathering. Before I explain what occurred subsequently and why that single phrase transformed everything, tell me, what hour is it for you currently, and from what location are you tuning in? I am intrigued to discover how widely this narrative will spread. To comprehend why that single remark struck the room like a shattered mirror, you must grasp the position I had been given within my household long prior to that autumn. In my father's interpretation of reality, my younger brother was the son who appeared logical. He possessed the achievements society identified immediately and applauded without requiring clarification. He held the prestigious corporate rank, the meticulously curated romance, the flawless digital presence, and currently, ultimately, an estate with a grand entrance my father could gesture toward as evidence he had nurtured at least one child properly. I was the son who demanded background details, and my father despised background details. He detested anything that could not be condensed into a single phrase at the country club, at luncheons, or during calls with relatives he covertly rivaled. Therefore, rather than depicting my journey truthfully, he reduced it until it appeared frivolous. He would claim I tinkered with vintage motors presently, as though I wasted my hours polishing junkyard engines instead of rebuilding classic automobiles, advising on rare vehicle acquisitions, and operating an exclusive garage clients reserved seasons ahead. He would remark I preferred an isolated existence, which was his method of converting focus into interpersonal inadequacy. He would state I was continually discovering my path, even after I had compiled a robust portfolio, employed temporary assistance during busy periods, and began generating more wealth than anyone in our lineage had anticipated from my efforts. The reality proved less accommodating for him. I did not accidentally fall into my vocation. I constructed it from scratch and established it through immense difficulty. While various individuals were performing neat corporate duties inside temperature-regulated skyscrapers, I was in garages at sunrise studying metal fatigue, engine block welding, bespoke painting, and mechanical overhaul. I discovered how to discern when a chassis merely appeared ruined and when it genuinely was unsalvageable. I determined how to value effort nobody admired until they witnessed the ultimate outcome. I figured out how to bargain with purists, how to manage affluent patrons who presumed a man dirtying his fingers would be thankful for receiving low compensation, and how to maintain my boundaries when spectators confused expertise with mere pastimes. There is a particular variety of hubris outsiders apply to professions they fail to comprehend. I encountered it frequently. I also defeated it regularly, yet, within my household, none of those victories held equal significance to a tidy achievement boasting excellent outward appearances. My brother Liam grasped this concept quite prematurely. He possessed an aptitude I lacked. He understood how to transform mundane daily occurrences into domestic spectacles. An advancement transformed into a festive banquet, a romantic milestone morphed into a holiday excursion everybody was forced to discuss. A furniture arrival became a declaration that they were truly establishing an existence currently. He was not more intelligent than me, nor more compassionate than me. He was merely articulate in the dialect my father adored, primarily observable success wrapped for praise, and since he realized this functioned effectively, he utilized it. Not with blatant malice initially, with a grin, with minor comments, with that refined pitch men adopt when they wish to offend you while remaining respectable during the act. If I missed a gathering due to labor, he would remark that Julian was far too bohemian for routines. If I arrived exhausted after completing a contract, he would observe that the entrepreneurial path appeared draining. He claimed he could never manage such unpredictability. If someone praised my projects, he would grin and add that Julian had eternally been remarkably imaginative. We simply remain optimistic. He transforms this into something adequately stable. He made me appear like an incomplete hobby project. My father made me seem like a liability. Together they fabricated a variation of me that extended family absorbed without ever verifying against the truth, and for excessively many seasons I permitted this. Not because I trusted their words precisely, but because rectifying individuals constantly is fatiguing. There exists a specific weariness stemming from needing to present yourself doubly, initially as you exist, and subsequently after your relatives have described you poorly. After a period, I ceased clarifying. I allowed them to undervalue me, because battling every remark seemed pathetic, and quietness appeared more honorable. However, tranquility carries a price. If you remain silent adequately long, certain individuals confuse your discipline with consent. They begin assuming the tiny enclosure they have placed you inside must be correct, because undoubtedly you would protest if it proved false. That autumn, my father believed he was evaluating his two sons. In truth, he was contrasting my apparent departure from his delusion with my brother's flawless compliance toward it. What he remained unaware of was that while he had been depicting me as unstable, I had already accomplished the most anchored action I had ever executed in my existence. 6 months prior, I had purchased an ancient hunting lodge in the mountains of Colorado, not because it appeared logical on documents, but because it belonged to my soul the instant I observed it. It was storm-battered, altitude-weathered, and filled with costly dilemmas that would have terrified anyone who desired immediate validation. The veranda drooped. The upper corridor carried a faint scent of pine and aged leather. The glass panes vibrated during the gales. Half the chambers appeared as though they had been abandoned intentionally, and I adored it instantly. I did not perceive ruin when I strolled through the space. I visualized structure. I witnessed heritage. I imagined a garage on the ground level, holding ample room for bespoke fabrication and mechanical repairs. I pictured a humble residence above, with dawn illuminating the dining area. I observed visitor quarters. I could gradually transform into a sanctuary for engineers and inventors who required peace and duration. I foresaw the precise variety of destiny that would never astound my father until it became completed enough for portraits, and that served as partial reasoning for why I retained the secret. I felt exhausted from being debated while I remained within the phase of development. I desired one element in my reality to flourish minus observation, minus contrasting, minus my brother posing inquiries using that deceptively relaxed pitch he utilized when he sought imperfections. I craved one happiness that pertained exclusively to my soul before the relatives placed their grip upon the prize. By harvest season, the shingle replacements were finished. The primary stairwell proved secure. My garage was functional, and I had endured enough evenings inside to memorize the noise of the breeze striking every wall of the structure. I had selected wall pigments, mended fractured moldings, polished entryways, mounted superior deadbolts, and stood solitary in the galley one freezing dawn, comprehending I had never experienced more conviction regarding anything. I was not floating. I was grounded in a manner my lineage had never attempted to visualize. They simply had not been welcomed to witness this truth. The most difficult aspect regarding being undervalued by outsiders is proving their assumptions incorrect. The most challenging element concerning being underestimated by relatives is discovering they might not desire to be rectified. My father's narrative regarding my path had never been coincidental. It proved advantageous. It allowed him to feel structured. It maintained the domestic ranking he favored. Liam was the comforting son, identifiable, respectable, simple to boast regarding. I was the complex child, skilled enough to reference, yet never in a fashion that endangered the hierarchy. My father did not declare these concepts blatantly, since straightforwardness could be challenged. He operated using delicate instruments like pitch, context, and exclusion. He would commend my efforts using methods that diminished my stature simultaneously. Julian is incredibly autonomous, he would state, which appears complimentary until you perceive the underlying message. Solitary, stubborn, detached from standard society, Julian has eternally pursued his separate agenda, which truly translated to unmanageable. Julian lacks traditional values, which within our bloodline served as cipher for not comforting enough to exhibit publicly. My brothers studied under the master. Liam never blatantly assaulted my character in a fashion any bystander could readily denounce. He mastered the art of sophisticated rejection. He would pose queries that appeared encouraging, yet were engineered to undermine. Do you receive health care coverage? Is such revenue strictly seasonal? What occurs should patrons cease arriving? Do you ever fret you are pouring excessive resources into something terribly specialized? He delivered these remarks before various audiences casually, as though he were purely inquisitive, yet his delivery remained eternally calculated. Never while I was suffering confidentially. Always when an individual had recently praised my work. Always when focus had rested upon my direction for a moment too extended. When I was 26 and secured an agreement to rebuild motors for a vintage racing exhibition, he inquired at a holiday feast whether I was ultimately finished dabbling. When I reached 29 and experienced my most lucrative cycle to date, my father informed an uncle that I was continuously cobbling together a trajectory. When I turned 31 and began advising collectors who provided recurrent commissions, Liam chuckled over espresso and declared that the hustle was remarkable in an eccentric manner. He insisted he simply could never endure that volume of instability. He uttered this while displaying architectural blueprints for a townhouse he had not even purchased previously, that represented his supreme talent. He could render mere desires to appear as triumphs and render concrete triumphs to appear temporary. At a certain juncture, I quit anticipating equity and commenced analyzing the cycle. My father required the household to orbit around observable indicators of prosperity because those indicators illuminated his own worth. My brother needed my alleged volatility because it refined his persona as the reliable offspring. It was not purely emotion, it functioned as architecture. If I unexpectedly emerged as irrefutable, the entire psychological commerce of the relatives transformed. My father would be forced to concede he had misinterpreted my path for decades. Liam would forfeit his preferred looking-glass. And humans seldom relinquish a complimentary narrative regarding their own lives without friction. That explains why the property meant so deeply to Liam, exceeding the literal transaction. He discussed the dwelling as though it were a diadem rather than real estate. Every dialogue during the seasons preceding the autumn feast navigated back toward the subject. The marble surfaces, the educational zoning, despite the fact he lacked offspring, the visitor chamber decor, the garden possibilities, the district ambiance. He transmitted catalog images to the group messaging thread and anticipated responses like an actor awaiting ovations. My father reacted precisely as anticipated, exceptionally proud of your efforts. Such a responsible maneuver. This demonstrates what constructing a destiny resembles. Subsequently, because nothing within our clan remained finished minus a parallel, he would telephone me privately and supply the interpretation. You understand, Liam has constantly remained incredibly disciplined. It is pleasant witnessing one of my children finalizing these choices. I desire this motivates your journey, my son. Motivates me to accomplish what exactly? Acquire an existence chosen purely for its comprehensibility. Exchange my garage for a dining alcove I never desired. Become decipherable to individuals who merely admired concepts they previously recognized. The ridiculousness of the scenario might have proved amusing had it not remained so perpetual. Nevertheless, I will not feign. I experienced zero emotion. Continuous rejection molds a person, even after you transcend trusting the falsehoods. There occurred evenings throughout my 20s when I rested sleepless, questioning if my father was correct, whether I had mistaken bravery for defiance, whether selecting a path that suited my soul, but amazed nobody represented covertly a variation of defeat. That demonstrates the variety of destruction relatives execute masterfully, not perpetually by shattering your boldness completely, but by injecting skepticism within your internal monologue. It required seasons to divide my reality from their observations, seasons to comprehend that my labor remained robust, my intuition proved valid, and my journey did not diminish simply because it resisted easy summation at festive banquets. By the era I acquired the mountain lodge, I was no longer attempting to prove their theories incorrect. That remains vital. I did not execute the transaction as vengeance. I finalized it because the space matched the blueprint of who I currently represented. Yet once I possessed the deed. Once I traversed those corridors and witnessed what my existence resembled devoid of their commentary resting upon its surface, I comprehended something I had not completely absorbed previously. They had never evaluated my progress truthfully. They had been protecting a myth, and humans guarding a myth frequently turn vicious when reality approaches peacefully. That is what rendered the autumn gathering hazardous. Not because I dreaded revelation, but because I recognized revelation was approaching for their egos. I nearly remained in Colorado that season. The frost had commenced prematurely. The garage stood packed, and I held sufficient valid excuses to bypass the domestic banquet, ensuring nobody could have faulted my absence. A feasting table heaped with ancient bitterness serves as no one's concept of celebration. Yet 3 days preceding the harvest feast, my grandfather telephoned. He never squandered vocabulary, which served as one justification I relied upon him above humanity. "Are you traveling homeward?" he inquired. I was stationed beside the immense steel bench inside my garage, polishing the rim of a rebuilt engine block, peering outward past the rear glass toward the chilled earth and the streak of silver mountain clouds behind the ridge. "I have not concluded my plans," I replied. "Then determine a solitary element beforehand," he responded. "If you attend, do not attend to absorb judgment. Attend firmly recognizing who you represent. That appears effortless, yet it proved complex. For decades, domestic assemblies possessed a method of scrambling my equilibrium. I would motor toward the estate, feeling capable, and depart feeling ambiguously incomplete, as though my victories had somehow grown difficult to embrace, merely because they were not mirrored backward adequately across the mahogany. My grandfather recognized this cycle. He understood the genuine peril never stemmed from the mockery directly. It resided within the ancient instinct, the prushly, words triggered, the urge to shield my choices excessively, to justify too meticulously, to diminish my presence, ensuring the chamber could remain pacified. He was additionally the singular member among the lineage who harbored knowledge regarding the lodge. I had presented the property to him during July, a week following the acquisition. The climate that afternoon had proven crisp and luminous. I collected him from the railway depot and transported him upward, anxious in a manner that astonished my core, not because I assumed he would critique the purchase, but because I valued whether he visualized what I observed. We halted outside the structure shortly past midday, the alpine breeze striking against our jackets, the entry stairs remaining crooked, half the ground floor, emitting scents of damp mortar and pine. The majority of observers would have registered expense, toil, postponement. My grandfather paused inside the vestibule, scanned toward the split molding, the sweeping steps, the antique iron hooks upon the plaster, where trappers' garments must have rested centuries prior, and grinned, as though he were welcoming an entity possessing immense spirit. "This sanctuary has endured," he murmured gently. "I appreciate that quality regarding the timber." Subsequently, he pivoted toward my stance and remarked that I had selected wisely. He navigated across every chamber deliberately, posing logical inquiries, avoiding theatrical probing. Which elements remained architecturally critical? Which zones could be postponed? What volume of restoration could I execute independently? Where would the machine bays sit? Had I allocated a financial buffer for unexpected disasters? That represented affection from his soul, reverence in the guise of earnest concentration, avoiding sycophancy, skipping abstract encouragement, delivering true validation. He rested upon an inverted barrel inside what currently functions as my office, and absorbed my speech while I detailed my strategy to renovate the visitor suites individually, eventually accommodating modest monthly escapes for designers, mechanics, fabricators, individuals who required silence and shunned a manufactured wellness corporation simulating such tranquility. He did not once question why I had neglected to inform my father. He comprehended the reason before I uttered a syllable, because distributing incomplete triumph with toxic companions can resemble setting fresh canvases along the trajectory of reckless fingers. Approaching harvest week, 3 lower-level chambers stood completed. The culinary space functioned smoothly, and the elevated flat ultimately appeared occupied rather than haphazardly arranged. I had mounted draperies inside the sleeping quarters, literature piled beside the settee, and a fractured emerald cup I perpetually utilized during dawn hours, because it rested flawlessly within my grip while I reviewed billing statements before daybreak. I had mended sufficient portions of the deck to linger outside, gripping espresso, and observe the frosted peaks without fearing the planks might collapse beneath my boots. Tremendous labor continued, waiting to be tackled, yet the structure no longer resembled a chore. It manifested as a destiny currently unfolding. The dawn I motored toward Massachusetts. I secured my personal main entrance and lingered there for a heartbeat amidst the chill brass within my palm. Gazing backward, past the exterior glass toward the lantern I had abandoned burning inside the parlor. It remains difficult to articulate how anchoring that sensation proved. For numerous decades, domestic voyages had transported the psychological hazard of forcing me to doubt my sanity. This occasion, I was departing from an unshakable foundation. I held a property deed bearing my signature, agreements resting atop my desk, machinery resting inside my garage, and pine sap permeating the atmosphere beyond my personal boundaries. Their perspectives might still burn, yet they could no longer dictate the reality. My childhood estate appeared utterly unchanged when I parked. Golden illumination radiating from the panes, decorations overly flawless to have been arranged by any impulsive soul. My father's interpretation of welcoming charm exhibited utilizing martial exactness. He unlatched the portal wearing a brilliant countenance that endured a maximum of 2 heartbeats before shifting into an administrative scowl. "Julian, you have arrived. Highway congestion, perhaps," he probed, subsequently observing my footwear. "Truthfully, perpetually appear as though you stumbled in from repairing a freight train." I remained occupied shedding my leather gauntlets. The critique required fewer than 10 moments. I traveled from my residence, I stated. He scarcely registered my response, because Liam glided outward from the lounge, sporting ivory wool and sheer victory. "You survived the journey," he declared, pantomiming an embrace near my shoulder. Impeccable punctuality. Father was recently informing the crowd regarding the property acquisition. Naturally, he was doing exactly that. My elder sister Clara approached from his rear hauling a platter and whispered that the atmosphere was already intolerable before continuing onward. That conveyed the entire situation to my brain. The gathering had previously selected its focal point. My mother embraced my frame in the scattered fashion parents adopt when they detect friction and pray physical warmth might substitute for impartiality. My grandfather, positioned beside the hearth, offered me a singular extended stare and the faintest inclination of his chin. "Refuse to diminish." Signal acknowledged clearly. While I suspended my jacket, I could sense the ancient mechanics of the bloodline commencing to rotate. Dialogues organized their flow into recognizable trenches. Liam emitted the variety of contentment that exclusively possesses logic when an audience happens to be observing the glow. My father drifted among clusters distributing the propaganda. I was required to inhabit my standard territory, pleasant enough to prove tolerable, silent enough to remain governable, prosperous solely within boundaries that avoided threatening the established hierarchy. However, I had motored forward, carrying an iron key deep inside my trousers and an altered backbone compared to the version I previously dragged back. I did not feel rebellious. I felt prepared, and that disposition proved exceedingly lethal. The banquet commenced, featuring the standard ballet belonging to a clan that favors metaphors over truthfulness. My father had arranged the dining surface, flawlessly, predictably. Tapers, polished utensils, creased cloth towels, the superior porcelain platters he retrieved whenever he desired the twilight to appear significant enough to be documented subsequently through lenses. Yet even prior to our settling into the chairs, the genuine attraction was never the cuisine. It remained Liam's estate. Every dialogue navigated its current backward toward that topic. The lawn, the entryway, the solar exposure, the subdivision, the pending visitor suite, the authentic timber flooring he discussed as though he had individually salvaged the planks from historic erasure. My father validated every fragment using a type of sophisticated awe that could have seemed moving had it not remained so calculated. "That bay alcove is what convinced my soul," he informed an aunt, despite the reality he was not the individual purchasing the structure. It simply projects the aura of a genuinely mature man's residence. Subsequently, once everybody situated themselves and the initial phase of dining had concluded, he hoisted his goblet and announced he merely wished to declare his immense pride. Observing Liam secure his inaugural property has provided remarkable solace to my spirit. There exists a profound reassurance in witnessing one of your sons genuinely grounded, one of your sons zero subtlety, never completely blatant, yet never disguised. Several guests whispered endorsements. My mother inclined her head using that lethargic, fatigued manner she deployed whenever she craved domestic peace stronger than she demanded justice. Clara gazed downward toward her porcelain. My uncle elevated his brow toward my direction for half a heartbeat, simply enough to indicate agreement. I registered the slight as well. I continued slicing my roast into tinier fragments than I required, which represents an action I perform while I am determining if a situation warrants my exertion. Liam interjected, displaying fabricated humility precisely on schedule. "Father, cease this praise," he stated, grinning in the fashion that translated to "do not halt your flattery whatsoever. It remains merely a dwelling." "Absolutely incorrect," my father responded affectionately. "It is never purely a structure. It represents duty, dedication, foresight. It signifies genuine worth." Then arrived the transition. I could detect the maneuver before he executed the strike. My father had perpetually cherished a contrast masquerading as benevolence. He rotated toward my seat, wearing the countenance he adopted whenever he needed the gallery to assume he was acting tenderly. "Julian, my boy, I pray you are avoiding feeling burdened. Every citizen maintains an independent clock. We simply experience anxiety occasionally. You possess skill, naturally, yet ability and security do not represent identical concepts." There the dagger rested. An entire childhood condensed into 2 phrases, adoration wielded as cushioning material surrounding pure disdain. Liam patted his mouth using his linen and participated eagerly. I assume Julian has constantly operated more in the clouds than on solid earth. He chuckled slightly, and a few attendees mirrored the noise, not because the joke possessed true humor, but because domestic gatherings compensate the assertive orator. You comprehend my meaning perfectly. He is perpetually bouncing from gig to gig. I stared at him directly, truly observed his essence. Flawless suit, impeccable grooming, supreme arrogance, the variety constructed from decades of being assured he personified maturity flawlessly. What he failed to comprehend was that he was lecturing an individual who had dedicated the prior week negotiating with plumbers, auditing construction ledgers, navigating material shortages, and organizing a summer reservation schedule for a compound I possessed entirely in title and fact. He assumed he was ridiculing a wandering elder brother. He was insulting an estate proprietor while reciting his father's lines. My father continued the assault, currently relishing the moment. "Your sibling recently secured a breathtaking residence," he broadcasted again, amplifying the volume, ensuring the distant edge of the dining room could thoroughly engage in the contrast. "A legitimate stronghold. I merely wonder, Julian, when shall you ultimately anchor yourself?" Liam tilted backward, displaying that tiny, gratified sneer I had memorized since puberty. "Exactly," he chimed, asking when I planned to cease hovering aimlessly and commence forging an actual legacy. That became the boundary. Not because the phrase represented the most vicious attack anyone had ever launched against my spirit, but because the delivery proved so rehearsed, so refined, so anchored in a fabrication they had echoed for decades, that they no longer identified the falsehood. It served as a complete philosophy compressed into a seasonal insult. I sensed the gallery anticipating me to execute the maneuver I had perpetually performed. Grin uncomfortably, pivot the topic, permit them to retain the narrative dominance. Alternatively, I placed my silverware downward deliberately, tapped my cloth a single time, allowed the quietness to expand precisely enough to force attendees to lift their gazes. Subsequently, I beamed. I have already achieved this, I stated. A person could practically sense the oxygen stalling. Liam's countenance did not collapse instantaneously. It froze initially, as if he anticipated the remainder of my statement to salvage his dignity. My father blinked rapidly, bewildered by the pitch rather than the vocabulary. "Pardon me," he requested. "I have previously established my roots," I reiterated peacefully. "I merely decline to summon anyone who undermines my vision." This instance, the mute atmosphere crashed heavily. An unknown relative at the distant edge of the board adjusted their posture. My mother raised her vision entirely presently. Clara ceased faking her appetite. My grandfather dropped his crystal and observed my face, maintaining a tranquility that registered as absolute backing. Liam released a clipped chuckle. "What exactly is that supposed to indicate?" "It signifies," I responded, "that 6 months prior, I acquired a massive lodge high within the Colorado peaks. I reside upon the land. I labor within the boundaries. I have been renovating the structure chamber by chamber. It functions as my shelter, my headquarters, and the bedrock of the upcoming evolution of my enterprise." That declaration rearranged the physics of the dining space. My father gaped toward my seat as though I had abruptly recited dialogue belonging to an alien play. "You purchased an alpine retreat," he echoed, and even amidst his paralysis, skepticism lingered, as if the explicit geometry of my triumph had insulted him by declining to appear basic. Liam's jaw clenched. "A massive estate up north." "Julian, that hardly equates to reality," but I interrupted before he could conclude the thought. "It is not identical. You procured a dwelling society can validate within a singular glance. I secured an existence that complements my spirit. Those remain vastly distinct concepts. For the inaugural moment, all twilight, numerous guests surrounding the prive feast studied my face, not viewing the domestic anomaly, but witnessing the sole individual wielding the singular honest phrase within the parlor. My father attempted to reclaim authority instantaneously. "Truly, son, that sounds akin to another of your little experiments," he murmured, sporting a fragile grimace. "Extremely fascinating. However, Liam purchased a genuine family compound. I rotated toward his position, and I obtained a territory possessing sleeping quarters, a commercial garage, visitor wings, profit-generating capacity, and authentic serenity. I remain uncertain why his transaction qualifies as maturity, while my conquest registers merely as aesthetic. That counterattack landed brutally. Clara exhaled the tiniest sigh of endorsement. My uncle dropped his silverware. Even my mother appeared as though she wished to vocalize a thought, yet recognized any utterance would expose excessive truth. Liam straightened his spine. "You have been concealing this triumph for half a year. I have been guarding the milestone for 6 months," I corrected. "A vast distinction exists. Once the reality rested upon the linen, the gathering ceased functioning as a jubilee and transitioned into what it likely should have represented decades prior, an unmasking, not regarding my trajectory, but concerning their toxicity. Because the exact second I announced my ownership over the soil, everybody positioned at the feast was compelled to display how they genuinely perceived my worth. My father demonstrated this initially. "Excellent," he muttered, composing his posture, utilizing the stiff grin humans deploy whenever they attempt to snatch back dominance via vocal inflection. "I assume that justifies why you have acted incredibly clandestine. although I sincerely wish you had informed the bloodline. Relatives are designed to distribute these victories. It functioned as such a slick script that an outsider who barely recognized his tactics might have confused the sentiment for rationality. Yet I comprehended the gears turning beneath the surface. He did not feel wounded by my lack of broadcasting. He felt outraged because a monumental achievement had materialized without filtering past his desk beforehand. He had missed the opportunity to package the story, grade the success, or tether his ego to the prize publicly. That constituted the true laceration. Kinship circles are additionally meant to listen without degrading every milestone into a tournament, I countered. My father's visage morphed following that strike. Not theatrically. Merely enough ensuring anyone observing closely could witness he had been conquered, not merely misinterpreted. Liam lunged forward before the mute tension could linger excessively. "Stop this foolishness, Julian. Do not twist the narrative into some massive victimization saga. You purchased a dilapidated shed. That remains wonderful. Yet it is hardly as though Father erred in claiming we exist within separate phases. Certain utterances expose significantly more depth than the orator intends. We exist within separate phases, as though my journey operated upon a lagging schedule, while his path represented the authorized blueprint. As if maturity functioned as a singular highway, and he had simply crossed the mandated checkpoint earlier. I pivoted fully toward his chair. "Separate from what standard exactly? Deviating from your personal tastes? Distinct from Father's capacity to boast regarding the purchase, utilizing a singular breath? Divergent from the variety of existence that compels guests to applaud prior to the pastry course?" Liam chuckled once. However, intense friction contaminated the sound presently. "You perpetually enact this drama. You transform everything into a philosophical debate whenever reality proves profoundly basic." "Incorrect," I replied. "Basic is the label you apply toward a situation whenever nuance endangers your superiority. That impact struck heavier than I calculated." He parted his lips and sealed them silently. My mother rustled within her seat and coughed nervously. That ancient domestic warning, translating to let us all retreat from the authentic issue. "Perhaps we should de-escalate the temperature," she mumbled. "Why should we?" Clara whispered softly, and every gaze snapped toward her position because Clara almost never breached the core of a dispute unless she felt absolute certainty. Why must Julian pacify himself after serving as a measuring stick the entire twilight? Father directed an inquiry toward him before the entire gallery. He merely responded truthfully. My father's skull whipped sideways fiercely. "Clara, cease your involvement." Yet Clara had obviously been stockpiling decades of suppressed irritation. "No, actually, let us proceed, because this dynamic has persisted eternally. Every instance Julian accomplishes something remarkable, the triumph gets downgraded into something ambiguous. Every occasion Liam executes a mundane task, the action transforms into evidence of moral superiority. You completely fail to hear your own bias, Father, yet the rest of society perceives it loudly. That shifted the atmosphere once more. Solidarity, whenever vocalized, perpetually achieves this phenomenon. It renders delusion incredibly difficult. Liam appeared paralyzed, less damaged by what Claire articulated than shocked by the reality that an ally had defended my corner publicly. "Oh, spare me this tragedy," he hissed. "Nobody is assaulting Julian's character. We simply refuse to pretend every eccentric choice he finalizes acts as some revolutionary conquest." Eccentric. That vocabulary choice should not have stung, yet it penetrated deeply. because it flawlessly encapsulated the clan warfare playbook. Diminish, distort, discard. Label the brutal achievement as quaint, ensuring you avoid having to revere the effort. Title the solemn victory as bizarre, allowing you to escape feeling intimidated by the scale. Eccentric, I echoed. I purchased industrial-grade hardware, refurbished a sprawling mountain compound, constructed a massive garage, locked in repeating patrons, and forged a bulletproof economic structure surrounding the enterprise. That hardly qualifies as eccentric. It functions as sheer infrastructure. Even my uncle released a quiet gasp following that breakdown. My father attempted to twist the narrative back toward parental worry, but the frequency no longer resonated. Julian, my boy, nobody is rejecting the reality that you labor intensely. Incorrect, I interjected. You simply reject that my grueling labor registers as maturity unless the outcome mimics Liam's path. His jaw locked tight. That accusation is unjust. It remains flawlessly accurate. A specific heartbeat occurs during particular domestic disputes when the most ancient blueprint turns visible instantaneously. An observer can practically witness the participants comprehending the skirmish does not revolve around the current evening. The war concerns 20 previous dinners, 15 minor slights, 10 seasons of manipulation, and 3 decades of assigned costumes, end quote. That exact juncture materialized then. My mother appeared exhausted, in a manner that implied stark realization. Clara looked furious, yet completely unsurprised. My grandfather appeared like a guardian, absorbing the truth finally echoing within a chamber he had waited decades for it to penetrate. Liam folded his arms defensively. What does any of this matter? This eruption stems entirely from Father declaring, I secured a magnificent home. You simply found yourself incapable of celebrating my success. I marginally respected the sheer arrogance fueling that spin. Reframe the dilemma as my failure to worship his glory. Textbook manipulation. I possess genuine joy regarding your milestone, I stated. I am merely furious concerning being utilized as your contrasting shadow. That muted even his defensive rambling for a moment. Subsequently, my father uttered the solitary phrase that rendered the entire dynamic more transparent than it had ever existed. Frankly, Julian, if you desired the family to view your journey favorably, perhaps you should have broadcasted your moves. Perhaps you should not have continued vanishing into this isolated universe of yours constantly, isolated universe acting as though discretion equated to treason, as if constructing a legacy outside the domestic spotlight represented a hostile maneuver. I reclined against my chair and analyzed his face, truly dissected his character. I witnessed not solely the patriarch who had condemned my efforts that evening, but the man who had authored my biography for decades inside chambers I never occupied. The man who had interpreted my drive as flakiness because that fiction provided him superior comfort. The man who lacked the capacity to fathom that hiding data from his ears might serve as a mechanism of armor rather than sheer insolence. I guarded the secret, I replied deliberately, because every instance I reveal an authentic victory. You shrink the scale or stack the achievement against Liam's record. I craved a singular triumph unpolluted by your grading rubric. A solitary domain within my reality that escaped conversion into domestic entertainment. That sentence struck the wood and remained anchored. Nobody twitched for a full heartbeat. Next, my grandfather vocalized his thoughts. The boy speaks truth. My father literally gaped toward the elder. Dad, please, cease your protests, my grandfather commanded, his tone tranquil yet piercing enough to paralyze the room. Julian remains absolutely correct. You have wasted decades discussing Julian as though he were a draft, simply because his trajectory fails to massage your ego. And presently, you feel outraged because he forged a masterpiece without surrendering the blueprints for your approval. Liam glanced toward my father, and for the inaugural instance, that twilight, the pair no longer appeared synchronized. They looked thoroughly unmasked. That remains the fatal flaw regarding toxic coalitions. They project invincibility until the exact second their mechanics are broadcasted audibly. My mother dragged a palm across her brow. Perhaps we have collectively leaped toward incorrect assumptions. Clara released an incredibly parched cackle. That represents a staggeringly polite vocabulary choice to describe the damage. My father's eyes appeared damp currently, yet I possessed enough wisdom to avoid confusing tears with actual repentance. I have sacrificed entirely for this bloodline, he whispered, vocal cords vibrating. And presently I am being painted as the monster simply because I feel pride regarding one specific son. Incorrect, I murmured softly. You are facing a reckoning because your praise perpetually requires a casualty. That represented the absolute core. That functioned as the nucleus. Not that he cherished Liam, but that he demanded affection operate as a comparative metric. Demanded one offspring to glow solely by casting a shadow upon the alternate child. Required admiration to travel via brutal rivalry, ensuring he could dictate the outcome. Once I unleashed that truth, even he appeared to comprehend the verdict could never be neatly boxed away. Following that climax, the banquet did not formally conclude. It simply dissolved, which represents a vastly different phenomenon. A standard harvest gathering finishes alongside pastries, breezy chatter, guests assisting near the sink, the friction melting seamlessly back into tradition. Our assembly misplaced the playbook completely. My mother attempted a fragile pivot toward tarts and espresso, but nobody genuinely pursued the diversion. Liam lingered within a quietness so rigid the posture appeared agonizing. My father continued realigning objects that required zero adjustment. A silver ladle, a creased towel, the positioning of a wax taper, which embodies the exact routine he performs whenever authority has evacuated the premises, while his biology refuses to accept the defeat. Clara began posing logical queries regarding the mountain estate, not utilizing a pitying tone, but displaying genuine intrigue. Total acreage, mileage from civilization, what percentage of the mechanical overhauls I handled personally. My uncle researched the coordinates using his device and declared that the territory looked absolutely breathtaking, showing authentic shock that caused my father to noticeably stiffen. Subsequently, my grandfather inquired whether I felt genuine joy residing there. The parlor transitioned into a unique variety of silence following that probe, considerably gentler, profoundly authentic, because that specific inquiry lacked any connection to social rank. Zero relevance regarding whether the acreage photographed superior to Liam's manicured lawn. It pierced directly toward the element my lineage had bypassed for decades. Did my journey legitimately suit my soul? I visualized the lodge during daybreak. The galley glass clouded marginally from the boiling water. The aroma of grease and roasted beans and freezing altitude. The friction of my freezing graphite dragging across billing sheets prior to the shift commencing. The welded banister resting beneath my palm. The massive steel bench inside the garage where shattered engines recovered their power gradually. The pine forest stretching past the rear boundary, rarely deafening, eternally steadfast. The sensation of unbolting my private entryway, following a grueling shift, and realizing nobody inhabiting those walls demanded I perform as a different character. Absolutely, I replied. I experience immense happiness upon that mountain. And that response provided more healing for my spirit than any tactical counterattack I had launched all twilight. Because for decades, a fraction of my brain had continually desired my relatives to authorize my decisions before I could thoroughly embrace the bliss hidden within those choices. That evening, I comprehended I had previously traversed that specific chasm. I did not require them to decipher my path in order for the journey to remain valid. Their ignorance no longer functioned as a laceration. It simply served as proof of our vast separation. Liam eventually grumbled that he still believed hoarding the data appeared incredibly bizarre. I studied his face. Perhaps, but not nearly as bizarre as forging your entire self-esteem upon another person remaining perpetually undervalued. Clara legitimately howled at that strike. My uncle struggled to suppress a grin. Liam's features turned glacial. The reaction avoided theatricality. Zero elevated shouting, zero dramatic departures. Merely the undeniable look of an operator recognizing the ancient strategy possessed zero efficacy presently. For the inaugural occasion during our existence, he failed to classify me as inferior without projecting exactly the petty persona he secretly embodied. Whenever the banquet ultimately dissolved, attendees wandered toward isolated chats, yet the psychological gravity of the twilight had already relocated irrevocably. I strolled toward the psychological gravity of the twilight, vestibule to retrieve my jacket, and predictably my father pursued my trail. He eternally favored covert reprimands following public humiliations. His vocal pitch plummeted drastically. "You humiliated your brother tremendously." I fastened my zipper deliberately. "Incorrect," I stated. "I merely humiliated the fiction you broadcast concerning my life." He happened to be standing excessively close to the blast radius. My father's jawline locked. Blood relatives refrain from executing such betrayals upon one another. That archaic defense mechanism, kinship, acting as an umbrella, blocking basic accountability. Bloodlines serving as the justification why the victim remains mandated to project grace infinitely longer than the aggressors inflicting the wounds. I had absorbed mutations of this doctrine my entire existence. Relatives likewise avoid weaponizing one son's victory to degrade another child, I countered. At minimum, a functional clan refrains from the practice. You are distorting the reality. I am diagnosing the disease. That represented the tactic he despised most fiercely nearing the conclusion. Not my pitch, not my pacing, not even the broadcasted defiance diagnosis. Once a poison receives an accurate label, it becomes tremendously difficult to disguise beneath tradition, tougher to pardon as mere personality flaws, more challenging to smuggle past customs disguised as parental worry. He stared toward my face for an extended duration, and I could witness his brain hunting for the previous iteration of my spirit. The boy who would melt, retreat, beg forgiveness for rendering the atmosphere uncomfortable. Yet the friction had already executed its objective perfectly. It had dragged absolute truth inside the boundaries. Prior to unlatching the exit, I delivered one final thought. You lack the privilege to label this dynamic as intimacy whenever the admission fee requires my total silence. Subsequently, I marched outward into the freezing atmosphere. The highway journey backward toward Colorado, the following dawn, felt utterly distinct compared to every post-reunion drive I had survived previously. Historically, following banquets, I analyzed dialogues, censored my memories, questioned whether I had acted overly defensive or excessively detached or wildly stubborn. That specific morning, I felt purified. Not giddy precisely, not victorious matching, some chaotic, cinematic vengeance fantasy, something superior, harmonized. My mobile device vibrated twice before my tires even conquered the interstate ramp. The initial text arrived from my father. combative and brief, declaring he prayed I comprehended the massive turmoil I had generated. Zero contrition, zero intrigue regarding my life. Purely damage control translated into digital characters. The secondary alert belonged to Clara. I apologize my spine required this long to solidify. I feel immense pride regarding your journey. I digested that specific message doubly. 60 minutes afterward, my grandfather transmitted a note. Next visit, I desire to rest upon that deck, holding black tea and survey the mountain ridge. That constituted the exact transmission that caused my airway to constrict. Throughout the subsequent weeks, the reality infected the clan exactly the way information perpetually travels whenever an individual shatters an ancient cycle publicly. Cousins telephoned. Inquiries flooded my inbox. Genuine fascination conquered blind assumptions. Certain relatives explicitly craved dramatic rumors. Alternate voices sounded authentically humiliated because they had swallowed my father's fiction regarding my character for so extensively long. The crucial element remained completely disconnected from the whispers. The victory resided within the pivot. Humans commenced communicating toward my face directly, probing concerning my enterprise, questioning regarding the estate, asking when they might tour the property, requests I bypassed highly selectively. My brother published several fragile statuses, digitally concerning individuals who lack the grace to celebrate peers, and the divide separating toxic narcissism from silent power, which could have provided comedy had the posts not appeared so laughably transparent. My father attempted multiple campaigns to repackage the harvest dinner as a tragic miscommunication. I blocked the revision. I bypassed the brawls. I simply rejected the amended script. That following thaw, my grandfather journeyed upward, precisely as guaranteed. He rested upon the reinforced veranda sporting wool across his lap, peered outward toward the timberline, and declared that the compound radiated my exact energy, unbreakable, deliberate, indestructible where the foundation truly matters. Subsequently, he navigated across the garage floor, stroked the massive steel hoist I had rebuilt, and beamed, projecting a pride that possessed absolutely zero covert agendas tethered beneath its surface. Not arrogance stemming from the delusion I had eventually morphed into an impressive enough asset. Pure joy because I had evolved entirely into my authentic self and anchored my soul there permanently. My dynamic involving my father never reverted toward its previous state, and that outcome avoids constituting a tragedy. Specific connections merely project intimacy because a singular participant remains perpetually digesting the poison that inflicts damage. Eliminate that destructive reflex, and the bond appears radically unrecognizable incredibly swiftly. Liam and I transitioned toward courtesy, utilizing a colder, far more transparent frequency. Clara and my soul grew tighter. My mother stayed exactly what she had eternally functioned as before, chronically delayed regarding reality, yet not entirely immune to its gravity. And my trajectory. I quit anticipating accurate translation from observers who heavily preferred my essence diluted. Therefore, this represents the truth I currently possess. Establishing roots does not equal a theatrical production. It does not resemble a blueprint. An external judge validates. It remains utterly disconnected from a checkpoint that snaps perfectly across a harvest banquet table. It does not involve rendering yourself readable for the gallery who purely worships a singular flavor of existence. Occasionally dropping an anchor requires selecting the storm-battered territory. Society discards because you possess the vision to recognize steel beneath the rust. Frequently, it dictates guarding your bliss until the seed develops adequate roots to endure brutal skepticism. Periodically, it demands constructing empires. silently ensuring the initial moment critics observe your masterpiece, they instantly lose the leverage to sabotage the progress halfway through. And quite often, the supreme form of vengeance avoids attempting to humiliate the critics who miscalculated your worth. The greatest retaliation involves answering the attacks so peacefully, so honestly, and from such an indestructible fortress that their complete fabricated profile of your spirit disintegrates beneath its own staggering hubris. That autumn my father assumed he was probing regarding when I intended to finally initiate my mature existence. What he failed to grasp was the reality I had previously commenced the campaign seasons prior, gripping heavy iron keys within my fist, carrying zero intention of requesting clearance. By the era he attempted to grade my worth anew, I was already standing tall inside a dominion he lacked the vocabulary to define. I was never delayed. I was never wandering. I was never a draft. I was strictly constructing an empire upon coordinates they had never bothered scanning. And once their radar eventually detected the signal, the individual trapped frozen inside absolute shock was entirely not my reflection. The paralyzed entity remained the exact bloodline who had fatally confused undervaluing my potential with genuinely understanding my soul.